Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Summit Podcast. I hope you are having a wonderful day as Christmas is approaching. We hope you have a wonderful Christmas season. So joining me today is my co-host, Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing? It looks like I got you on your lunch break today.
Well, you never know where you're going to get me, or when you're going to get me, or what time of day you're going to get me, or. But yeah, I'm
Well,
doing good.
yeah, especially as a parent, because then sometimes mornings may work for you, and now they just don't work anymore.
Well, you
Or
got
you got sick kids or whatever, so we just have to try to get it in when we can.
6-month-old daughter just did not want to be put down yesterday and cooperate. So
Yeah, and by put down sleeping, not putting her down like so I'm coming off a staff meeting, and every time when staff meetings ends, I get so wound up. I'm just sitting there the whole time, and I'm like, "Oh, I need to move. I need to do something." So I'm in rare form today. So maybe this will be a good podcast or a bad podcast, depending on
I
how
don't know.
this
People got
goes.
quite the kick out of last week. You not editing out the part where I was talking to a coworker.
But you're doing some great evangelism, and I wanted people to showcase your evangelistic skills, Micah.
You told me it wasn't allowed because I didn't pay my Atlas fee.
Oh well, you can. I'm not in charge of Atlas.
You do a better job.
Well, I'm also not the general director either.
I don't think the general director has anything to do with it.
No, but yeah. I mean, the general director could always go, this program sucks. And then how many people are this? Like, well, now you have to figure something else out because your general director just threw you under the bus and your whole website and your whole plans for church management.
You should like go stand outside of the offices in Anderson and be like, "We want Ministry Connector back. We
Oh,
want it back."
well, I have to make sure I go to the right ones. The last time I forgot that they moved, I was like, why is there like a I'm going to the old ones. I'm like, why is this a self-storage unit here? What happened to the Church of God? They've sold their building to self-storage. Oh well. Anyway,
Next time you
that's
go to AU, it'll be nothing but like a storage unit place where you can go to rent places where you can put your storage.
uh-huh.
And the campus will have nothing but those little units lined up all over campus.
Jeez. That's our new dormitory now. Budget cuts. Your new dorms are going to be at a self-storage
You got to
unit.
make budget somehow. We're going to turn Myers Hall into a storage unit.
Jeez. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a kid who's like living in a storage unit because like $49 a month. Yeah, I'll take it. Better than paying how much I have to live to Don or Rice or anything else.
But can I get Wi-Fi and heat in here?
I mean, I'm sure if they're climate controlled, if they're self-climate controlled, then all you need to do is figure out your Wi-Fi and you're set.
You need a proper address.
Well, they have their student address, so they'll just go to this university in their mailbox. They don't have to worry.
I meant for the Wi-Fi. You know how you have to give an address for like when you get your Wi-Fi hooked up.
Oh, they could send it to the university mail. Let's send my Time Warner bill to
Reardon
11
Hall,
11 Fifth East Street, Anderson, Indiana.
Reardon
But
Hall, Korean.
yeah, so oh man, yeah, as far as stories gone wild, we had our preschool Christmas performances yesterday, and I have to tell you what, it's always interesting because with kids, especially preschoolers, because I've been with them. I saw their performance yesterday evening, but then I also was at their like two performances just to get them used to being on the stage, singing, making sure they're singing loud and everything else like that. And there was one kid up there who wanted to hide behind all the other kids, didn't really want to sing, was very shy, did not want to do anything. And I'm thinking, man, this kid's not going to show up for a performance. This kid's going to be a nervous wreck. So then everyone's there, everyone's singing, everyone's clapping. Then that third classroom goes up there with that kid who's like hiding behind kids. And that kid starts singing the song and he's making faces. He's singing, he's getting into it. He's making faces. He's even like dipping it low and doing some like break dancing and stuff on stage at the church. And I'm dying. I'm taking pictures up from the balcony and I'm laughing my head off. I'm like, what happened to this kid? It's like he's super shy. And then you have like hundreds of people there seeing him. And he's like, hey, everybody, look at me. So, and my kids are going to have their performances on Christmas Eve. So I'm just always, I'm always intrigued by you never know how people are going to do in a performance when there's live people there because either they're going to freeze up or they're just going to go all wild and just act insanely crazy. So that was my stories gone wild. It was just a good time. But what about you, Mike? You got one? Besides me not editing out your evangelistic endeavors at work class episode?
Oh, I mean, we should start kind of chronicling my journey through parenthood.
Oh.
And last week, I think Thursday or Friday, my daughter got sick and she was just, I think it was just like a cold or something like that. A lot of
Hmm.
congestion and things like that. And a baby can't blow their nose or, get the excess snot out of their head. They just
Hmm.
can't do it. And so you have to do it for them, whether it's, manually or they sneeze or whatever. And so she usually eats, I would say, about 4 times a day. And she had not been eating as much, and it's not that big a deal. She was still eating, so it wasn't like a matter of her not eating. It was just not as much. And so yesterday, I got around to feeding her around lunchtime, and it was, I don't know. She had been eating about she averages 6 to 8 ounces, and so she ate all 8 ounces, and she sat up and she burped, and it all just came out.
Oh
Literally every bit of it. Like, and it wasn't.
no.
I mean, it was mucus, it was snot, it was formula, it was all over me, it was all over the bed, it was all over her, and quite the mess to clean up.
Yeah, I bet. Jeez
Like that kid pukes
Louise.
on me more than she pukes on her mom.
Well, that's what it's like being a dad. But do you have do you have a similar issue that Laura and I have? Like usually I'd get thrown up on or spit up on, but Laura would always get pooped and peed on.
Um,
Or do you say it's pretty even between the two of you, the puking and the peeing?
well, I find with the peeing and having a girl, it's not as bad, obviously, because it's pretty self-contained. Unlike a guy or a boy, they have, you know, you have to put the shield up, right, when you're changing a diaper. Um, I will say though that like, some of the blowouts she's had from like newborn to present, she'll be 6 months old this week. But there was one time I had picked her up and I heard something and I was like, oh, please tell me you didn't go. And I'm walking down the hallway and my wife's like, do you not see that? And I'm like, no, because she's like, the baby's facing me. I'm
Yeah.
holding her on my chest. But
Yeah.
Alicia took a picture and she had a blowout and it went all the way up the back of her onesie.
Oh.
And so I'm just walking around campus at Miami. We were at the school that day for whatever reason. I think we were still on maternity leave. And
Hmm.
she had a blowout and it was just blown up all the way. I'm like walking all over campus and through the building and stuff, and got a baby that needs a desperate diaper change slash wardrobe change. So
Flash shower.
baptism,
Oh
dunking,
my goodness. Yeah.
full submersion.
Yeah. Well, if there's one thing about parenting is that you get very humbled pretty quickly as far as, thinking you have all the answers, thinking you know what you do, think you're the best parent. And something comes along, you're like, man, I don't know what the heck I'm doing. This is nuts. Which kind of goes a little bit with our topic today. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of ego in ministry. And kind of what spawned this topic is I was listening to a video, and there was these two gentlemen who apparently, have been partners in ministry for a long time, and they're having a conversation about how like sometimes when they're the one thing that why their friendship was so strong is that when they would be working on an assignment or they'd be trying to develop plans for whatever their company or ministry or whatever the case may be, um, if one of them was ever to a point where they were just hunkered down and they were just like, nope, this is the way it is, we're going to do it this way, we're going to, I'm not going to move from this position. I think this, kind of really hunkering down on whatever their point is in the discussion at hand. Their buddy would always say, well, why are you so invested in this? Is this the spirit or is this your ego? And it would always kind of send anytime when they had permission to say that to each other. So anytime when that got said, it was like one of those things where they had to really be self-reflective and go, this is kind of my ego, and maybe this is not what, even though I think it's best, maybe this is not what's going to be best for others. This is not going to be best for ministry, etc. So I was thinking of, so that kind of really spawned this topic of just ego and ministry. And I don't know, Mike, I mean, we both have, I mean, combined with all our ministry experiences from camp to working in churches to doing consulting to everything that we've all done in ministry, especially being a pastor's kid, like how often do you see ego in ministry? And out of all those times you've seen that ego reveal itself, whatever the thing is, how much of that has ever gotten calmed down by just saying like, "Hey, this is the spirit," or usually does ego kind of win out in those situations?
I mean, it's just, I mean, it depends on the situation. And I've seen a variety of different illustrations. Some can be staff related, some can be lay people related, and for me, it's always frustrating to see things get to that point, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that
Yes.
is that, like, if somebody has an ego, where there's an ego in a situation, it's because people have either fed it or they just have fed it themselves, and it's spiraled out of control. And when you get to that tension, when you get to that argument phase of one's ego or a situation's ego, it's because it's like a fire, right? The more you feed it, the bigger it gets. And
Hmm.
so it's hard to deal with, you know, if we broke it down in between what it would look like on a pastoral staff and look at what it would look like on a parishioner side of things. Um, I think there's this balance where you want to recruit volunteers as pastors to cover the different areas of ministry, whether it's children's or students or
Hmm.
worship or technology or various roles where you can serve within the church. And um, it can be difficult because people don't always want to either A, play nice, or B, they want to do it their way. And it's not for the betterment of the church and the ministry and the mission of the church. And I have seen it time and time again where somebody gets their feelings hurt and um, their ego got the better of them and they left the church.
Hmm.
So I think a great example of that should have been like my story's gone wild. A
Hmm.
great example of this is when I was a little boy. My dad was pastoring a church, and there was a family who was about the same age as my family. They had two kids. We were, we had four, but the two kids were about the same age as me and my younger brother. And my friend, his name was CJ. Like, I think you talked about Peter having a friend at church a couple weeks
Yeah.
ago. But, like, CJ became a really good friend of mine. Well, my dad was pastoring at that church, and um, really, uh, he was the one that introduced me to professional wrestling. He was the one that introduced me to video games. We
Hmm.
I had my first sleepover at his house. Like it was, growing up in the 90s, it was fun. And so the church had its annual business meeting, and CJ's dad didn't like something that my dad had presented to the church in the annual business meeting. And tensions rose, and CJ's family got upset and they left. And I never heard from CJ again.
Hmm.
Recently, in the last year or so, he and I connected through social media and we talk on a fairly regular basis. And we've reconnected. And I don't know that our parents have ever spoken again, but we have. And that's the power of social media and being able to connect that way. But I say all that to say that, you know, it not only has an impact on the person who's doing it, where the conflict that's happening, it has a ripple effect. It can affect those around you. And um, ego is a powerful thing, and and I don't mean in a good way. It can be pretty toxic.
Yeah, and that's a great example of how I think in that moment you don't really think about. And I think let me go back. When it comes to when ego happens, it's almost like it's the only person point of view you always see is yourselves, right? And you don't really think about the consequences of everyone else, how it's affecting everyone else around you. And I think that's especially true in ministry sometimes because especially churches where a lot of smaller churches, if someone has a big ego, whether that's the pastor, whether that's a another church staff member, or even if it's a parishioner, everybody in that room or everyone in that church is going to feel it in some way or another. The outfall, the fallout from that. Where when you think about kind of like your bigger, larger churches, it's almost like the congregation doesn't really see it or notice it as much as those who are directly working on staff, right? Or maybe you have an issue within a larger church. Maybe there's an issue with one person and maybe a group of people, and that may be confined to that group of people, maybe in that time slot of service. But like 8 o'clock, you have some people naysayers at the 8 o'clock service, but then the 9, 10, 11, and 12 o'clock service, it's like night and day depending on what's going on as far as
How many services are
how
you
people
having?
act. What?
How many services are you having?
Well, I'm talking about larger churches that do
I know
have
I'm
like
being funny
services.
because I'm
Like
like,
I
man,
don't.
you have an 8 o'clock, a 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and a 12 o'clock.
Jeez. I
That's a
mean,
lot.
that is a lot of services. So I say all that to say that, I don't think I've ever seen anybody win by allowing their ego to go unchecked. Uh, I know just in what I've seen in my ministry, there's been times where not only have, and I'll say this, I think there's times where I've kind of let my ego shine forth. Mainly because maybe there was something that I was pushing that I thought was going to be a great benefit for the church. Or it could have just not even be me saying something or me doing something. It could have just been just the way I think, right? Because ego doesn't necessarily have to be communicated outwards. It could be communicated inwards. And I mean, I want to know how many ministers have ever thought, or even parishioners have thought, well, if I'm not doing this, if I'm not in charge of this ministry, or if I'm not the main teacher of the Sunday school, or if I'm no longer the pastor here, then everything's going to fall apart. And that is ego talking. Whether that's true or not is kind of irrelevant at that point because at the same time, ego's talking about it. Um, and it just kind of builds this sense of, and again, ego only builds up one person, and that is the person who has the ego. It doesn't build anyone up else around them. It doesn't build up a group. It doesn't build up the church, especially it doesn't build up the church. It only builds up one individual, and that's the person who's letting their ego go unchecked.
Yeah.
Unless I'm wrong, unless there's other times where ego benefits other people, but I've never seen it.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think you nailed it right on the head there because it's like nobody wins when there's a situation like that. I mean, people get hurt, the person gets hurt, the person you've offended gets hurt. It has, like I said before, a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Um, you know, the I can say with undoubted, certainty that, I've been in the same place you have, Scott. Like um certainly when I was younger, right? Like nobody can do this. I got it. I know how to do all this. Why do I need other people to
Hmm.
do this? Like, I don't need people's help. Uh, I'm indispensable, you know, and my ego's gotten in my way, and pride comes before the fall, and you know, I would adventure to say, if looking back 10 years ago on my younger self, I would be very critical of the way I acted, and I would be I'd probably be lying if I didn't say that, hey, I left that ministry situation because I thought things were bad. And everybody else was responsible, but I had nothing to do with the backlash of what was going on.
Hmm.
It's everybody else's fault but me. But that's a life lesson I think that goes with maturity and longevity in ministry is that, yes, it could be your fault, but you're not the only one to blame. But you should
Yeah.
also take responsibility saying, hey, you know, I'm gonna assume responsibility for this, and I hope you forgive me, but I think it's time to move on, and
Hmm.
XYZ.
Yeah, and I think it's and I think that's the other thing we have to think about, especially like within churches, is that it's not about one person or group of people winning, right? Because again, like everyone loses in the end, right? Just because this parishioner or this pastor was able to get their way or their vision or whatever thing they're campaigning for, they got that done. Eventually, it's going to get to the point where it's going to have a ripple effect of everything. Um, so there has to be this sense of humility, and there has to be the sense. So even especially like within like board meetings, when there really is a very big point of contention, I think that's also kind of like in some ways why I'm in some ways I don't like board meetings too much is because on one hand you want to make sure everyone has a voice and everyone has their opinion, but at the same time it's almost like one of those things where you're now trying to have a debate over something at a meeting that most people don't want to be at, right? No one's ever says, "Man, I can't wait to go to a board meeting. I want to sit here for 3 hours talking about church business." Some do, some enjoy that, but most people, I would say, they probably would opt out or not even show up to the board meeting. So when you have a point of contention or about like, oh, we have these extra funds and we're thinking about either, and one person says, hey, let's get a new playground for our kids ministry, and another person saying our parking lot looks like junk, let's repave our parking lot. And now you have a point of contention. At the end of the day, let's say the parking lot people win, right? And they got that, so everyone voted for the parking lot. Well, initially you might have some hurt feelings from the people who won the playground, and maybe there might be some people who might leave over the matter. But then overall, what happens when 5 years down the road your playground starts falling apart, or it's to the point where it's deemed unusable now because it's dangerous? And now what are you going to do? Because now you're going to have to do something about it. So either now you have the choice of either A, trying to ask the church to do a campaign to get a new playground now, or you just tear down your playground because it's a hazard and you can't have it anymore, which is then going to kind of put more pressure on what are we going to do for our kids since now they don't have a playground to play on anymore and for kids ministry. So I think in those moments when you're at that point of contention, and let's say, one or the other wins, it's almost like we have to kind of have this thing. If we can't get to a compromise and we do go with one project or the other, we also have to make sure that, hey, your opinion matters. It just seems like this seems to be the more thing, but we are going to try to do something to work on trying to get a playground. So yeah, maybe that nice big donation is not going to the playground, but at least there's an acknowledgement that this is a need too, and we need to, as a church and as church leaders, we need to be aware of this on how we're going to deal and navigate this matter of trying to get a new playground. Because again, there is a need for it. Um, then I think, especially like in relationships too, you have to kind of almost be humble in a sense that, especially as pastors, that you are not the single blessing that's going to make ministry happen. Because there's too many times where I've seen people who've been in ministries who've not only left churches or lost their churches feeling defeated, but even people who have lost their marriages because they've made comments or they probably might have at one point told their families, whether verbally or indirectly, saying, well, the church is important. I have to be at the church. I have to do this. I have to do all this stuff because if I don't, then it's all going to fall apart or it's not going to get done. So I have to be there. So the ego kind of puts a super self importance on making the church leader feel like they're like a superhero. And then eventually they sacrifice for this church and for other people at the cost of their marriage or at the cost of having a great relationship with their kids or their families. Um, so, that's another way on how ego can kind of destroy that from a church perspective and not a business perspective and even a family situation. So, even in that case, what I tend to do there is if I know I have to be somewhere, I almost would have to say to Laura, hey, I'm going to do this, but I am going to make it up to you. I'm going to make sure I take it easy. Or if there's something happening, like Laura might say, well, hey, don't you have somebody who could do that? It's like, well, let me just call them and see if they can do it. And I just make a phone call saying, hey, here's this issue. Are you able to take care of it? Because, and if they say, yeah, I can be over there in 15 minutes to take care of this like building issue, then it's like, well, I don't have to do it because I'm in close proximity to the church. So I'm always like the first person to deal with it.
Yeah, I think I learned learned that the hard way in one of my last ministry assignments because it was like I was just to the point where I couldn't do it. And
Hmm.
I had to realize it wasn't worth my blood pressure or my health or my sanity. And I even told my wife that I was like, it's not fair to you. It's
Hmm.
fair to you to, that I'm spending all hours of the day and night at the church and not, spending time with you. And um, I had to come to the realization that the church is going to be there if I am or not.
Yeah. And I think that's the other thing too, that I think a lot of pastors who, if their ego gets into the way of feeling that super self-importance that everything's going to fall apart if they're not there. Like if you already have that mentality, then you have to realize that you're not the most important person in the room. Even though you have a title and you may have the title lead pastor, you're not that important in the grand scheme of things when it comes to like the king as far as the kingdom. But B, if that's something that's been adopted while you're working at a particular place because you know the history, you see kind of how everything's kind of already going downhill, and you do have that pinch of, man, if I don't do anything, this place is going to fall apart. Like that's probably when you're going to have to realize that, if you're at a church where there has been a decline for years or a lot of trouble for years, that even if you leave, and let's just say you do leave and the church closes and everything else, that's not on you. That is a long line of just poor management and bad circumstances that have happened that just kind of got that church into its place that it's at now. That is not on anyone's fault. Like Like if I was pastoring a church and the last pastor happened to embezzle money or have an affair and I'm working and I feel like, man, if I don't do this or if I can't show up to this or if I can't be on call 24/7, then the church is going to fall apart without me. Like, no, the church was already falling apart. And it's not your responsibility to kind of be the master builder to keep everything together because you're not called. I mean, we're only called to lead and to shepherd. We're not called to fix everything.
Let me ask this: how many pastors actually live their life and ministry by that?
I think there's a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot of pastors who live their life by that, that if they leave, things are going to go right. And I mean, I actually it was very interesting too, because I was in a meeting with some youth pastors, and this one lady was talking, and she was saying how, she was at a children's ministry, and, they had a children's ministry of about 120 kids, pretty big, vibrant youth children's ministry. And then she left because, at that point, I think there's some new changes in leadership and they want to go a different direction. So she decided to kind of bow out. And plus, she was at a different season in her life where she wanted to do something more. And even though she did everything she could to make sure that the thing kept running smoothly in her departure and during this transition, when she left, like the next couple of years, that ministry went from 120 to maybe about 20 or 15 kids. But then she even said, and she was even saying, like, it's so hard because you feel like, because, one of the other pastors felt like in that meeting made the comment, well, if I'm not here, then I don't think it's going to get done. Like, people say they want this thing, but I'm the one who's doing it. And if I don't have any volunteers to help me, it's just not going to get done. But I can't keep doing it because it's taken a toll on me. And even but this other pastor said, when it happened, I felt hard that like everything dropped, but over a couple other, after, they've had some other people switch in and out of there, it's starting to grow again. And now they have about 80 kids there now. And so it was kind of one of those things where it's like, if God's in control, then God's going to make things. And I don't have to worry about leaving something behind because at the end, I was there for that season. And if I was able to do that a good for that season to have a ministry of 120 kids, that's great. But if I had to leave, so that other people within the church can finally get to the point where they have to say, okay, do we really value children's ministry? And if so, we need to step up and do it and not put so much pressure on our pastoral staff to take care of it and do it all the time. Then maybe sometimes taking a step back or just saying, hey, I can't do this anymore. It's taking a toll on my marriage. It's taking a toll on the relationship with my kids. It's taking a toll on my mental and physical and spiritual health. Like, church members, if you feel like that youth, children's worship, hospitality, all these various aspects of ministry, if you feel like that this is very important, then other people have to do it with me, or other people are going to have to take it over for me because I just cannot do it anymore. And I think, when a pastor's able to say, I can't do it anymore, or I need help, or even come with the posture of, hey, church is not about me, it's about Christ. It's about the showing off the beautifulness of the body and how well the body can work when we work together. Then that's the message that has to be communicated from everyone in all your ministry teams and all your leaders, so that there is that humility of breaking that humility of saying, it's not about me. And for the pastor who feels like that they have to carry everything on their shoulders, remember, it's Jesus the one who says, take my burden for its light. And I know in ministry, we can kind of get to that point where we may think that the ministry we're doing is actually the Lord's work, but it's not. If it's too burdensome, if it's too heavy, if you're getting to that point where you feel like you have to push everything or bulldoze over people to get what you want because you feel like it's going to be the best thing for the church without trying to lead people, you're just bulldozing them, then at that point you have to take a sense of, you have to have that humility and go, okay, it's about the kingdom. It's not about me. It's about God's kingdom, not my legacy or my pride or how this church is going to remember me or anything else like that. Because in the grand scheme of things, we're called to lead. And if we're not called to lead at that place anymore, we're going to go. And who cares about legacy? Who cares about marks? Who cares about accolades? Like in the kingdom, that stuff is not, that stuff you can't take with you in the kingdom. The only thing that matters is if you believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, He died on the cross and He was resurrected from the dead, and you're saved. It doesn't matter how many people you got saved. I don't think God's keeping a tally board, and because you led 50 people to Christ, you get higher up on the ranks in heaven than the person who led 5 people to Christ. Like heaven's not a competition, so we don't need to get our egos in check
I was
or let
gonna
them run wild.
I was gonna suggest how many pews you donated, or how many hymnals, or how many plaques you have hanging over the building.
Yeah,
I would argue that that's
absolutely.
idolatry.
Don't say that too loud. But yeah, I mean, it is. I think, and that's the thing about ego is it's not something that people just come in with a big ego. It just kind of develops over time. It develops from past hurts. And sometimes I think ego develops when you are right about something. Like if I go, hey, if we don't fix this, it's going to cost the church a lot of money if we don't take care of this now.
It's gonna cost us more down the road.
It's going to cost us more down the road, so we need to take care of it now. And when people say no or they vote no or do whatever, and then it does happen, and now the church is struggling, going, okay, how are we going to do this? Because we need a heating and cooling unit, but it broke, and we don't have the money to replace it because it's now too expensive, and we don't have it in budget. Like at that point, as a pastor, I could see like, well, I was right, and now the church is in trouble. So then when you go to another place and you're running into a similar situation and you're kind of saying this, it's almost like that ego just slowly builds. Well, I was right about this. I was right about this in this ministry. I was right about this situation. And after time, when it eventually gets to the point where no one listens to you, and you now see that, oh, if we would have did that, or people say, yo, we're sorry, you're right, and people keep saying that, that's what builds ego. I don't think a lot of time it just comes. It's just a lot of times where people get wounded or they get hurt in ministry that eventually they kind of get very pompous and they say, well, hey, if you guys would have listened to me, then we wouldn't have had this issue. If you guys would have listened to my inclinations about this person that you guys wanted to hire, we wouldn't have to be dealing with this huge blow up now, or this huge case, or this huge scandal now, if you would have listened to me. So, so I think a lot of times with ego gets defeated in community, and ego gets defeated by humility. And then ego also gets defeated if you give someone permission to be able to call you out when your ego gets too out of control. So like if Mike, if you and I are working at a church and we're on leadership, and I have it where it's like, hey Micah, if my ego ever gets the best of me and I start acting like I'm very high and pompous, you have permission to knock me down a peg. And I kind of liked in the video where they said, is that the spirit talking or is that your ego? And like had that permission to do it in a very sensitive way, to be able to really self-reflect and go, because I know in the moment if someone goes, oh yeah, it's just your ego talking, I'm probably not going to take that well. I'm probably like, oh yeah, well, you like, no, like there has to be a way to be able to do it, but you also have to be able to give permission saying, hey, if I'm acting foolish, if my ego's getting the best of me, if you feel like that if my personality or my ego's getting in the point where it could be damaging to congregants or to just the overall ministry and structure and the logistics of the church, then you need to say, hey, you might want to check yourself because right now it's getting too intense. And I don't think you realize that what you're saying or what you're doing is going to cause a ripple effect down the road. So, any final thoughts on this topic about ego and ministry, Micah?
No, I mean it's just I believe it's just another thing we need to take serious and take into consideration that it is an issue.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right, friends. So let us know in the comments or send us an email on what you think. Are you someone who struggles with ego, and are you someone who gives permission for someone to call you out on it? Like, what are some of your strategies as church leaders to really help put your ego in check? Um, for others, if you've had an experience where someone's ego kind of got out of the way, like Micah shared about, about his childhood friend, like his dad, like how sometimes that can kind of cause an issue or can cause problems. Like, we like to hear those stories as well. But friends, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll be back on with another episode soon. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.